Hi there, my name's Rachel, and thanks for joining me today for another true crime story. I'm going to get right on into talking to you about Chris Porco and his family and what he did to his family. But first, I have to cover a couple of things. Number one, thank you so much. The channel passed 450 subscribers today, which is like absolutely unbelievable to me. This is an awkward thing to do, but I am kind of awkward. So just a big thank you to each and every one of you who has decided that it was worth sticking around for a while. It makes me feel a lot less like I'm talking to myself and a lot more like I have friends. So I really appreciate that. Number two, you will see I've got a shirt on here that says completely wackadoodle. One of my subscribers had mentioned that if I ever made merch, they would love to have something that says completely wackadoodle on it, which is apparently something I say a lot more frequently than I realize. So I thought that was a cool idea, went ahead and designed it. It's got this completely wackadoodle design on the front, and it's got the channel name on the back. It's just kind of a silly thing, but they are available in t-shirts and sweatshirts on Teespring, and I will leave that link in the description. If you do decide to buy a t-shirt or a sweatshirt, a few bucks of that purchase does come back to me to help support the channel. So if you feel like doing that, you certainly can. And thank you. Okay, that's enough housekeeping. Let's get into the crime. Roll the disclaimer. So the Porco family were a middle-class family that lived in a nice but modest two-story house on Broccoli Drive in Del Mar, New York. And I know what you're thinking. It's not broccoli. It's like broccoli, not the vegetable. But that's neither here nor there. The family consisted of 4 members. Father Peter Porco, a 52-year-old law clerk. Mother Joan, who was a speech pathologist in the local school system. Older son Jonathan, who was an officer in the U.S. Navy. And the youngest son, Christopher Porco, who was a liar. I mean, he was also a college student and vet tech for a little while. But yeah, mostly a liar. So let's talk about it. On November 15th, 2004, Peter Porco, normally a very reliable employee, did not show up for his job at the courthouse. Eventually, they just sent a court officer over to his residence on Broccoli Drive, just sort of for a wellness check to find out where he was and why he didn't show up for work. He found Peter lying face down just inside the doorway of his house, completely unresponsive and soaked in blood. Obviously, this court officer called the police right away for assistance, and when the police arrived, they really were able to assess how grisly this scene was. They found blood not only on Peter, but also on the stairs, down the hallway, in the kitchen, and in the bathroom. They were able to follow the trail of blood all the way up to the couple's bedroom, and in the bedroom, they found Peter's wife, Joan. She was still in bed and had horrifically disfiguring wounds to her head and face. And at the foot of the bed was what they presumed to be the murder weapon, a fireman's axe. As the police came further into the room, they realized that somehow miraculously Joan was still alive. So of course, EMTs rush into the room, try to get her stabilized, and get her to the hospital. She was rushed into surgery right away, but she did end up losing her left eye, a chunk of her skull, her face was completely disfigured, and she was in a coma. Now, I don't know if this was a medically induced coma or if it was just a coma that she fell into naturally from the trauma, but she was messed up and very lucky to be alive. Peter, however, was not so lucky. Peter had been unresponsive from the very beginning and was, in fact, deceased. But he had not died right away. By looking at the blood evidence in the house, the police were able to see that Peter had suffered a terrible head wound that had caused him some kind of brain damage, but he was still alive and he had gotten out of bed and sort of on autopilot started his normal morning routine. So he went into the bathroom, brushed his teeth, all of that, came downstairs, began to cook himself breakfast and load the dishwasher, went outside to get the paper, and as he came back inside the door, with the newspaper, that is when he finally collapsed. The strange thing about this scene was that there was no obvious motive. Nothing had been stolen from the house, as if this was some kind of robbery gone wrong. The police noted that the screen had been cut out of the window for a window that led into the garage, but it was not possible to enter the house that way because Peter had put nails in the frame of the window, so it would only lift up a few inches. The house had apparently been broken into before using that window, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So he had essentially nailed it shut so nobody could gain entry that way. At first, the investigators weren't entirely sure how a perpetrator would have made it into the house in the first place. The Porcos had no known enemies, just nobody who was an obvious suspect for this really brutal crime. So of course what they want to do is locate the couple's children. Now Jonathan was away on some kind of training or something for the Navy. He was nowhere near, but their younger son Christopher was just about 230 miles away at the University of Rochester, where he was attending school at the time. So the cops immediately put out an all-points bulletin to find Chris. But before the police could even find him, he was accidentally informed that they were looking for him when a reporter from a local newspaper came to his dorm to try and talk to his roommate about the family. So this is ostensibly the first time that 21-year-old Christopher is hearing that his parents were murdered in their own home with an axe, or that his father, at least, was murdered. At this point, nobody was 100% sure if Joan was going to make it or not. So Chris did what I suppose anybody would do if just being informed that their parents had been slaughtered the night before, and he calls the police in his hometown of Delmar. He says, hey, I just heard that my parents were murdered or something. Did you want to talk to me? I mean, he's like the most... I'm doing this wrong, by the way. The kids don't do this for telephone anymore. They do this. Did you know that? It feels wrong. So he's just having like the most casual conversation with the police that you could ever imagine. No being upset. He just asks, hey, so should I like come there or something? So the police, of course, tell him, yeah, we need you to come up here and have a little chat with us. So later that day, he goes and he has his first interview with the police. Chris doesn't know it yet. He is at this point the only suspect that the police have in the murder and attempted murder of his parents. But I hear you say, he was 230 miles away when they were killed. Why would he be their primary suspect? You remember how I told you that Chris was a liar? Well, police had begun to uncover a series of financially motivated crimes that Chris had perpetrated in the years leading up to this situation. He had been selling items on eBay that he didn't have. He would just post the item, get the money, and then never send it. Customers who had purchased the item eventually contacted him and asked, hey, where's my stuff? He would pose as his brother. And by this, I don't mean he would say his name was Jonathan. He would just say, oh, I'm Chris's brother, and he died. And then he would just tell them that he had no way of getting the item to them and no access to the money to give them their money back. And he had done this several times. He had also on more than one occasion staged burglaries at his parents' home, pretending that there had been a break-in and taking items of value, specifically 3 laptops. Also, there had been a camera reported missing at one point. That camera was later found in the yard, so I'm sure he was going to take the camera too, but just dropped it on his way out. So you go back to the screen that had been cut open in the window that I talked about that Peter had basically nailed shut because they had had a burglary where somebody broke in that way. I don't think they ever had a legitimate burglary at all. I think it was always Chris pretending that a stranger was breaking into their house and taking their stuff. It was actually him the whole time. And it seems as though his parents never got wise to this, which is incredible. Continuing on with Chris's pattern of lies, he had been very not truthful with his parents about his school. He originally had started out at the University of Rochester, but he was kicked out for his poor grades. So he ended up moving home after that. His parents were quite disappointed, but they were glad to know that he was going to go ahead and start taking some classes at a community college there in Delmar in order to sort of earn some better grades so he could maybe get back into the University of Rochester. Unfortunately, he also failed out of the community college, and when he did, he took off for a vacation to England. His parents didn't find out about this until he was already in Europe, and the police uncovered an email that his father had sent him talking about how disappointed they were that he had failed out of college again and then just left the country on a whim and didn't tell anybody about it, giving him the guidance that he needed to come back home and take care of all of this. I mean, they were really upset that he kept failing out of school. He assured them he was absolutely fine, that there was some kind of mistake made. The lowest grade he had ever received was a C on some test, so they shouldn't freak out. When he got home, he was going to make sure it was all taken care of. Absolute lies. He absolutely had failed out of school yet again. But once he gets back from England, he decides, well, to make my parents happy, I've got to get back into the University of Rochester. So what is his solution? Does he go back to the community college, ask them for another chance, take a couple more semesters, work really hard, and then earn the right to transfer into the University of Rochester? No, of course he doesn't. Working hard is not what Chris is all about. What he does do is call up his parents and tell them, hey, great news, you guys. It turns out that the University of Rochester should never have kicked me out in the first place. They found out that one of my professors lost one of my finals, and that's why my grade was so bad. They found it, and they're correcting the mistake now, so I can come back to school. And not only can I come back to school, but they're going to pay my tuition for this semester because of all the trouble they caused me through their mistake. Of course, all of this was an absolute fiction. What he actually did was forge transcripts from the community college to make it look like he had done a couple of semesters and gotten straight A's and earned the right to get back into the University of Rochester. The university accepted these fraudulent transcripts and allowed him back into school. But of course, now he has the issue of how to pay for it. He can't go ask his parents for any money because he told them that the school had made a mistake and therefore they were going to pay his tuition for the semester. So he probably went and got a part-time job and worked really hard and saved up enough money to pay the tuition himself, right? Of course, he did not do that. What he did do was go to Citibank and take a loan out in the amount of about $31,000, which he forged his father's signature to get. Not only did he pay his tuition with this money, but he also used part of it to finance a brand new bright yellow Jeep Wrangler. Now, it's a little bit unclear to me when he took the loan out, if it was before or after he had gotten back into the university. I wonder if it wasn't a little bit before and maybe he had used some of that money to pay for his trip to Europe. I don't really see how he would have had the money to do that any other way, but I'm not sure. None of the information is really that specific on exactly when he took that loan out. But what I do know is when Peter and Joan Porco found out that their youngest son had been abusing their credit. And investigators were able to find the email that Peter Porco had sent confronting him about all of this really negative behavior. In it, Peter lets Chris know how unacceptable this behavior is, lets him know that he will be calling the bank to have his name taken off this loan, and also informs him that if he abuses his credit again, he will be forced to take legal action to protect himself. He also says that his mother and he still love Chris very much and that he's confident that they're going to get through this. So obviously with my research on this case, I saw and read a lot about what people thought about Chris. And a lot of people seem to characterize him as a spoiled brat or a spoiled frat bro. And I have to strongly disagree with that characterization. Spoiled means that you are handed everything. You are given whatever you want without having to work for it, without any expectation. In fact, you, as a spoiled person, have the expectation that your parents or someone is going to not only financially provide for you what you need, but much, much more than you need. And by all accounts, Joan and Peter Porco had expectations for their children. They expected them to work hard to earn what they had. They had academic expectations for their children and expressed disappointment when those expectations weren't met. They did not just give Chris whatever he wanted the moment he asked for it without expecting him to earn anything. In my opinion, Chris was not spoiled. He was entitled. He was angry that his parents didn't provide him with cars, allowances, other things that maybe some of his friends had, and he was jealous of. He felt like his parents owed him support, and he did not want to work for that. In my opinion, Peter and Joan were good parents. They supported him as much as any parent should, while also holding him to reasonable expectations. Calling him a spoiled brat kind of puts all the blame for his behavior onto his parents, the victims of this attack. And I don't think that's fair. Peter and Joan did fine as parents. Sometimes you just get a bad egg. And that is what Chris was, a bad egg. So that basically establishes the motive that Chris would have had to attack his parents in this way. He wasn't getting what he needed from them. They had caught on to his little scheme, so now he was going to be in debt to them, and he couldn't take advantage of them anymore. On top of that, he had severely disappointed them to the point that they were unlikely to financially support him at all in the future. But what about him being 230 miles away on the night they were attacked? I mean, he was at school, right? Well, not exactly. Chris was a criminally minded person, but luckily for investigators, that mind was not so beautiful. He had given investigators a weak and easily disprovable alibi for that night. He had told them that that night he was so tired, he just fell asleep on the couch in the common room of the dormitory that he lived in. Of course, what do the investigators do? They go straight to all of the other kids that live in that dorm and say, hey, did you see Chris sleeping on the couch that night? And every single one of them, some of whom were his frat brothers, said no. They had a movie night that night. Almost everyone in that building was in the common room watching a movie until the wee hours of the morning. Not only was Chris not asleep on the couch, he literally was not there all night. And in fact, through security footage, they were able to see Chris leaving campus in that audacious lemon yellow Wrangler he had just bought at about 10:30 p.m. on November 14th. And then they see him coming on back at about 8:30 a.m. on November 15th. So it takes around 3 hours to get from the University of Rochester to Chris's parents' house, and then 3 hours to get back. That gives him from about 1:30 a.m. to about 5:30 a.m. that he could potentially have been in his parents' house. By the way, absolute side note here, but didn't Harold Henthorne, which was my last video, didn't he drive a Jeep Wrangler? I know it was a Jeep. Was it a Jeep Wrangler? It's a very weird coincidence. Is that the Jeep thing that I wouldn't understand? Anyway, I'm sure that owning a Jeep doesn't make you a murderer. No. So in addition to the footage from the campus security cameras showing that Chris was in fact not at all on campus during the time his parents were being hit in the head with an axe, they went and talked to some of the toll booth operators that were on the exits that Chris would have had to pass to get from school to the Porco family home. So the first toll booth operator that they talked to worked on exit 46, which is the exit that Chris would have had to go out of in order to get to his parents' home leaving the school. It's just outside of Rochester. And that employee said, yes, they had seen a vehicle matching that description coming through at about 10:45 p.m. They talked to another toll booth operator at exit 24, which is much closer to Chris's parents' house, and they said, yeah, there was a bright yellow Jeep that came flying through here like a bat out of hell at about 2 o'clock in the morning. So these times that he was seen on these toll exits fits perfectly within the timeline for him to go there, attack his parents, and get back to school by 8:30 in the morning. And furthermore, there was a neighbor of the Porcos right there on old Broccoli Drive who said they woke up at about 4 in the morning, looked outside, and did see the yellow Jeep there in the driveway. So with this timeline and all the eyewitness accounts along the way, plus the earlier established motive, that's basically the prosecution's case. Chris had the motive and the opportunity to try to kill his parents. What the prosecution didn't have was literally any kind of physical evidence at all. There was no blood, no hair, no fingerprints, no shoe prints, absolutely nothing physically placing Chris in that house at that time. But here's what I'm wondering. That was his parents' house. He had lived there. He had a room there. So his fingerprints probably were there, but they just really couldn't use them as any kind of evidence because it's his parents' home. So you would assume that his fingerprints would be everywhere. And there's no way that they could distinguish fingerprints from a month ago, from that night. So my guess would be his fingerprints and hair and stuff probably were all over that house. They just couldn't really use that to establish that he had committed the crime. Because if your DNA is found in a place where you are on a regular basis, that means nothing, right? Nothing in my research specifically stated that that was the case. I'm just assuming that makes the most sense to me. But more importantly than just what they found in the home is what they didn't find on Chris or in his vehicle, right? So they didn't find any bloody clothes or shoes on Chris. There was no blood inside of his vehicle, which, ideally you would have something like that. But remember, when the crime was actually committed, there wasn't that much blood. They did have forensic experts come in and explain when the Porcos were attacked, there would not have been that much blood based on where the perpetrator was standing and how they were hit with the axe. The reason that things were so bloody by the time the police got there was because Peter had gotten up out of bed and wandered all over the house, bleeding on everything. It would have been much easier for Chris to avoid getting a lot of blood on him. Not to mention, like I said, this was his parents' home. It seems very likely that he may have had a room there, extra clothes there that he could have changed into. He had also at one time been a vet tech, and his boss from where he had worked there testified that he was taught how to clean up blood without leaving a trace after surgery. And of course, we already established he had plenty of time. So there's no reason to think he couldn't have come in, attacked his parents, and gotten himself completely cleaned up before he left. However, not having any physical evidence is clearly a weak point in a prosecution's case. But what they lacked in forensic evidence, they more than made up for in people willing to take the stand as witnesses to tell the jury about Chris's lies and their generally negative opinion of him as a person. Those people included many of his frat brothers, his actual real brother, Jonathan, whose demeanor on the witness stand towards Chris was described as icy, and Jonathan also described his relationship with his younger brother as strained. The one person who was Chris's most steadfast supporter was, surprisingly, Joan Porco, his own mother. And let me tell you why that's a little bit weird. See, when the medical personnel had showed up at the crime scene to get her out of there and to the hospital, they testified that one of them had started asking her some questions. When the investigators had mentioned that no robbery had taken place, one of them had asked Joan if a family member had done this, and they say that she nodded yes. She couldn't talk at this point. Remember, part of her skull is gone, and her face is mostly gone at this point. So all she could really do was nod, but she nodded an affirmative yes to the question, did a family member do this? The next thing that he claims he asked is, "Did Jonathan do this?" And she shook her head, no. He then asked, "Did Chris do this?" And she nodded her head, yes. So it was very surprising to everyone when Joan Porco came out of her coma and claimed that she did not remember the event at all. But she was 100% sure that her son could not have done this. She claims that all the stuff with the money was just family stuff they were working out. There was no animosity between them and their child. Did not have any recollection of answering any questions before she was taken to the hospital. And obviously in this situation, I feel truly, my heart just goes out to Joan, because what a horrible thing. What a horrible thing to happen. Your husband has been killed. Your son is on trial for that murder. As a mother, I know how we sometimes view our children's behavior as reflections on ourselves. And I imagine that when your child does something this terrible, this horrifying, especially if they do it to you, it can be really difficult to rationalize with yourself how you could have raised this person, how you could have given birth to a human being who is capable of such brutality. I believe her when she says she doesn't remember based on her injuries. That would not be rare to have amnesia over that. It seems as though she's willfully ignored the amount of evidence that they have against Chris and the amount of no evidence at all they have against anyone else. I can't feel anything but good feelings for her, because that would be so horrible. My heart just really goes out to Joan Porco in being faced with such an impossible situation. Okay, so at this point we understand what the prosecution's case was. So what about the defense? Their strategy focused on 4 main points. First, they pointed out the lack of physical evidence, which I agree is a weak point for the prosecution. Second, they had Joan Porco's own statement completely refuting that she made any kind of nodding gestures or statement to any first responders indicating her son's guilt. And that certainly is a very strong point. She had terrible head trauma, all the things we already discussed. I don't need to go over them again, but that I think is probably the strongest point for the defense. 3, they put forth that eyewitness testimony is extremely unreliable and that the toll booth workers and the neighbor could have been just completely mistaken about what they saw or the time they saw it, and that also is not untrue. Eyewitness statements are notoriously unreliable. And number 4, we have their theory of the crime, which I think is their absolute bottom of the barrel weakest point in this whole case. Here was their theory. The Porco family is linked to the Bonanno crime family, that means the mafia, through an Uncle Frank Porco. Now, it was a little unclear in my research if this man was Chris's uncle or if it was Peter's uncle, as in Chris's great uncle. I think that it was Chris's great uncle, this guy named Frank, who was a captain in the Bonanno crime family. And in that circle, he was known as Frankie the Fireman, because he used to be a fireman. I'm not trying to get on the mob's bad side, but not a lot of creatives in that bunch, I'm thinking. Just saying. So the defense was saying that this was actually a retaliation hit. The fact that it was done with a fireman's axe was the message they were trying to send, that they were going to come after the Porco family in retaliation against Frank from snitching on the family and becoming an informant. There's so many problems with this. First of all, at the time of this trial, Frankie the fireman Porco was in jail, and he was in jail for not snitching. So nobody was going to be coming after him to retaliate for becoming an informant when he was literally serving time because he refused to be an informant. So that argument goes completely out the window. And the second thing is that fireman's axe belonged to the Porco family. It was in the home. And the idea that the mafia would send a hitman hoping to find a weapon and using an improvised weapon, and then also, by the way, leave both victims alive when he fled from the home, is insulting. It's just an absolutely ludicrous notion that this could have been a professional mob hit. So there is one last little piece of evidence that I had left out earlier that really helped seal this case for the prosecution. They were able to determine through the logs of the house alarm that someone had entered the passcode to turn off the house alarm. So whoever it was that came into that house was a member of the family. They had to be, they knew the passcode to turn off the alarm. And they had not bothered to reset the alarm when they left, as if maybe somebody had forgotten to set the passcode because their mind was preoccupied with other things. For instance, that they had just tried to murder both of their parents. I'm just throwing that out there as an example. So it was August 10th of 2006, 2 years later, when the trial ended and the jury went back to deliberate about Chris Porco's guilt. And they came back very quickly, within the day, with a verdict of guilty of second-degree murder in the case of Peter Porco and guilty of attempted murder of Joan Porco. Chris was later sentenced to 50 years to life on each count, meaning that even with good behavior and everything else, he will serve a minimum of 50 years. He would be 73 years old by the time he leaves prison. Since his incarceration, he's had several failed appeals, and he also filed a lawsuit in 2013 against the Lifetime television network. Yes, Lifetime, the made-for-TV movies people, because they were making a movie based on his crimes called The Romeo Killer, the Christopher Porco story. I'm not sure what about that story brought forth images of Romeo, but I can tell you that I will not be watching this film to find out. He was arguing that the film violated his civil rights because it was essentially a fictional story, but it used his name and some of the elements were correct, and because it was attaching his name to these fictionalized things that he didn't do, he felt that broke a law of some kind. It is Lifetime, so I think we can all assume that the film was criminally terrible, but other than that, it was determined that what they did not actually break any laws, which they finally just ruled on this past summer, 2021. So Christopher Porco is currently housed at the Clinton Correctional Facility in Dannemora, New York. And that is everything that I've got for you about this case. Again, thank you so much. You make this worth doing, and I am so happy to make these every week and to know that people are watching and enjoying them. What do you think about this? Is there any room for Chris to be innocent? Let me know in the comments box below. And other than that, please take time to take care of yourself today and every day. Even if all you can do is put on a clean pair of pajamas, that's fine, you know? It's good for your mental health. Don't forget to click the link to purchase a completely wackadoodle merch shirt if you want one. And I will see you next time. Bye!